The Cisco CCNA curriculum goes into great detail on how to secure network devices like routers and switches and firewalls, and I'm going to talk about that here. Now, most of the labs in the CCNA security curriculum cannot be done with Packet Tracer, but some in the early chapters, a few of the labs can be done with Packet Tracer, so that's what I'm going to do right now. Once you've downloaded and installed the Packet Tracer program and you've run it, if you want to, what you do is you go down here and you grab your network devices and then drag them onto this stage, and then you can configure them, and you can also test them to see if they communicate with each other, and you can establish network communications just like as in a regular network. So for instance, I can click on routers here. Now it tells me I'm in my routers, and I'm going to grab a, let's say, 2811 router and drag it and drop it here, right? Then I'm going to click on the next devices, switches, and I will go and I'll get this 2960 switch, right? Okay, now the way you interface with these devices is interesting. You can click on them and it opens them up in a separate window, and you can look at the physical areas of the router and zoom in and zoom out and see all the ports that are on. You can also look at cards that you can add to it. You can see some graphical user-based tools for configuring the routers, and then most importantly the command line interface, which is where you're going to want to do most of your learning from the command line interface. And this is just a quick and easy way to manage the router. The switch is the same thing. You can click on it, and then once again you've got the physical aspects, the graphical user tool for configuring. You know, you can change some settings here, of course, and the best way to do it is to learn the command line interface, which Cisco expects you to know. Then to hook up these two devices, what I'm going to do is I'll click on this lightning bolt, which is the connections, and a router to a switch connection. We're going to use a straight through cable, which is the black line. We're going to click here and put it into the fast Ethernet 00 port, and then go over here on the switch and put it into the first port here, let's say 01. So now I've got the router connected to the switch. Now that we have the router and the switch connected, you can see our red lights showing that we do not have up ports on those ports. We're also going to connect a PC, so we're going to click on End Devices. I'm going to grab a PC here and drag that out here, right? And that'll act like a PC on the network. So we're going to get another, click on the lightning bolt for the connections, grab a straight through cable, and we'll connect from the switch, let's say to port 10 all the way to the fast Ethernet port on the PC. Notice the port by default is on the PC, so since the port is on, the Ethernet port is on the PC, we instantly start getting green lights and some activity here. Okay, next thing we need is we're going to get another PC, and this PC we're going to place here, and this will, and instead of a PC we could even use, let's say, a laptop, and we'll say that this laptop is an administrator who's going to console in to the router. And console in means it's using a console cable, also called a rollover cable, and we'll click here and we'll go to the R232 port, the serial port, and then we'll connect into the router to the console port. So that's a console direct connection to the router. Alright. Now to console in and manage your router from your PC or your laptop, just like you would on an actual router, once again you have to have a console cable. And what you're going to do is you'll click on the laptop, and you're going to click on the laptop and you'll go to desktop and you'll click on terminal, which is a tool like HyperTerminal, right? You would probably be using PuTTY or something like PuTTY if you were actually doing this from let's say a Windows 7 laptop. You probably wouldn't be using HyperTerminal anymore, but HyperTerminal is in Windows and you can install it in Windows 7, and it's there in Windows XP old school. You click on HyperTerminal and it has the serial settings for serially connecting with a terminal to the router through the console port. So bits per second, data bits, parity, stop bits, flow control, and you have to know these settings for the Cisco CCNA. Okay, and probably CCNA security. Once you're there, you can see that the router has booted up, it started up. It asks you if you want to do a wizard configuration or system configuration dialog, which is kind of like a automated dialog to get your router up. And typically we don't use that in the curriculum in the academy, so we're going to hit N for no and just hit enter, and you're left with a router prompt. And now you can start configuring your router. Now the text here is a little bit small to read, so even though this is how you want to manage your router, I like to go and just click on the router, and I've made the text a little bit bigger so that it's easier to see in the video, and so I'll just configure it from here if you don't mind. Of course, on the Cisco exams, if you were in a simulated lab exam or essay exam, test exam, you're going to have to configure your routers and switches usually from a device consoled in or remotely connected in to the router or switch. It's usually happening from a host or client. Usually you will not be able to just click on the router like I did and bring up this command line interface in the simulated exams. Okay, now that you're in the router, it's time to configure it, get everything up and running, and then we need to secure it, and then we need to do some advanced security measures that heighten the level of security on the router. Okay, so I'm left here at the router prompt, and you can see the default name of the router is router, and we're at user mode, and we're in the router without any password or any username or anything. So you can see that this is a first time installation, right, or a first time configuration. You've got a brand new router, never before been used, and you're sitting there. So what are you going to do, right? So the first thing we need to do is we'll type enable and hit enter, and that gets us into privileged user mode as indicated by the hash here. Okay, so now that we're in privileged user mode, to get to global configuration mode, we type configure terminal and hit enter, and now the prompt turns into a config hash, which indicates global configuration mode, and this is the main configuration mode. Now we'll start with a number of commands to start securing the router right away, and also to bring up our interfaces, right? So we have an interface that we need to bring up right here, this Ethernet interface, which is Ethernet port 01, right? Now on yours, I've turned this off. If you go to options, preferences, you can say show port labels, right? I'm going to do show port labels, close that, and now you can see that that's FA00 right here, and on this switch FA, which stands for Fast Ethernet 01, and then this one's Fast Ethernet 010, right? Okay. All right, first things first. We're going to change the host name of router, and we'll change it to Dan's courses. So we'll say host name Dan's courses, right? Or Dan-R1, right? And now the name of the router has changed. Okay. Next thing we know we need to do is bring up that interface on Fast Ethernet 00. So we're going to say interface FA for Fast Ethernet 0/0 and hit enter. That takes us into interface configuration mode, and from there we put in the IP address, IP space address 192.168, and we'll just use a one network 1.1, then the subnet mask. Alright, hit enter. Now the IP address is on the interface. Then we need to turn it on. No shut down. Okay, now the interface is up. If we minimize this, you'll see, or pull it down, you see that now we've got a green light, and the switch is going to go from shutdown mode to listening to learning to forwarding, and this orange light will turn green in a second, just like an actual switch would. When you plug into a port, it takes a few seconds for it to go to forwarding mode and for the light to turn green. Okay, so now that we're here, we can type end to get out of configure interface mode. We do that and hit enter again, and we're back to privileged user mode. Okay, let's start securing our router's management interfaces, right? And what we mean by that is two ways that we're going to secure this router's management interface. We're going to secure the console port, right? So we can console in so that it's not wide open, right? As long as anybody has a rollover cable, right, and has access to the router, and they could just plug in and get right into the router, right? So we're going to secure the console port. We're also going to need to secure the ability for people to remotely manage the router by connecting remotely into the router through a program like Telnet or SSH, right? And so the interface that we're going to need to secure there would be the virtual terminal interface or the virtual terminal interfaces. So we're going to secure both of those interfaces. There's an additional interface that you could configure, which is the auxiliary interface. If you click on the router, you go to physical, and you zoom in, you can see that there's the console port, there's the auxiliary port. The auxiliary port is another management interface that is supposed to connect to a modem so that you could dial in and then manage the router. Now typically this is not used too much in the curriculum. The CCNA security curriculum does show you the commands for configuring this port. I'm not sure if I will do so here. It may be on the exam, you never know, but mainly the console port is the one that you're going to focus on. And then if you're going to remotely connect to the router, you're going to remote in through the Ethernet ports, right? So the router needs an IP address, first of all, for you to contact it, right, remotely. You know, you can't telnet or secure shell to a machine that doesn't have an IP address, right? So I'm going to go back to command line interface. So let's start with just securing the console interface. What we'll do is we'll say configure TER, I'll hit tab completion, configure terminal, gets me to global config mode, and then I'm going to type line console 0, and that will put us in the line configuration command to configure the console login. Alright, so there we go. Now I'm in config-line mode, and I can configure access to the router. Now the most insecure way to do it is to just say password Cisco. That gives line console 0, the console port, the login port, the password Cisco. Right? You do that, and then you say login, and then you type end. Right? And what did that do? Well, what it did was, if I exit out of the router, I'll type exit. Now I've exited the router, and I've just, let's say, hyper-terminaled in, and I hit return to get started. I have to now put in a password to get into the router. Before I was just at the router prompt, you know, in right away. Now I have to type Cisco, right? So that's the first step in, let's say, securing the router. We've just given it a password, right? But the curriculum goes much farther and much more secure than just a password Cisco on the console port. So, but that's a good place to start, right? And one of the reasons that it goes farther than that is if we type enable to get to privileged user mode, we can do a show running tab, show running dash config, and you'll see that as I hit the space bar and go more down into the this is the running configuration file of the router as it stands, hardly anything in it. But if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, I hit the space bar a few times, you can see that line console 0 has the password Cisco, and there's the password right in the configuration file. Right? This is a security risk. If someone was able to get a hold of the configuration file of the router, let's say you were backing up the configuration file across the network, and someone was to intercept that traffic and grab that configuration file, they could look at the configuration file and see the password right there in what we call plain text or clear text. Okay, so we're going to want to encrypt that. Also, here is the line virtual terminal interfaces that are used for telnetting or SSHing into the router, and you can see that it's It's here, and the login command is even there, but there's no password set to it yet. So we're going to do that next.